International Atheist Alliance is pleased to present Part 1 of a three-part series. Americans United for Separation of Church and State linked concerned citizens across the country by means of satellite communication to augment local programming. Kay Schenk, president of the Orange County chapter of Americans United, coordinated the Los Angeles, California event. She was ably assisted by Marjorie Spitz, the national staff advisor who traveled to Los Angeles from AU headquarters in Washington, D.C. Dr. John Suarez welcomed participants and led off with a brief update of legislative activities related to separation of church and state.
I have been asked first to do a quick legislative update to bring you up to date as to what's happening legislatively. Early in the history of the radical religious right, they correctly identified public education as the single most important hurdle to overcome on the way to a theocracy. As you will see, most, maybe all of the things that I will mention this morning have a direct bearing on public education. The biggest worry for us separationists for the last several years, particularly since the elections in November of 1994, is the prospect of a religious equality, sometimes called the Religious Freedom Amendment. This was dubbed as the crown jewel of the contract with America. There were versions introduced at the federal level by Representatives Istook, Hyde, more recently Army, and in the Senate by Hatch. The consequences of this legislation, of this amendment, were it to pass, I think is something that we'll probably be considering throughout the day today. I am glad to report in this aspect as a legislative item that none of the amendments introduced came to a vote, and so now that the House and the Senate have gone home for the end of the year, it will have to be re-raised if it is to be considered in the coming legislation. There are two reasons we think why this failed or didn't come to fruition, luckily. One is that the conservatives assessed that the climate was not ripe for this to be considered. And secondly, the intra-fighting among the conservatives as to which version of the amendment to be put forth also delayed and interfered with its ultimate passage. So that it means that after the first of the year, the composition of both the Congress and the Senate will be very crucial as to whether this amendment is resurrected or how far it would go. Next, we have the Parental Rights and Responsibility Act. Again, time this morning does not permit to explore it in detail or consider its consequences, except to note that were such an act to be passed, it would play havoc on the curricula of the public schools. At the federal level, this legislation also died, only possibly to be brought up again when Congress reconvenes. Similar type legislation has been introduced in well over half of the states, and it has not passed anywhere, although it has come very close to passage in several areas. In California in particular, the parental rights legislation did pass the Assembly Education Committee, but it failed in the full Assembly. Next is the ever-present issue of vouchers. The radical right from the beginning, promised that they would not let the idea die, and indeed they haven't. They have continued to bring it up time and again, each time refining it and trying to avoid the pitfalls that led to its previous demise. The radical religious right does not believe in evolution, but they practice it. Their persistence in the area of vouchers is somehow hard to accept, except that it does create a lot of havoc, given that polls consistently reveal that the populace is against vouchers, and in most polls that turns out to be a 2-to-1 margin. There was even a poll taken of Republicans which showed pretty much the same result, 2-to-1 in favor of not having vouchers, but rather in favor of beefing up and improving our current public educational system. There are voucher proposals pending in over half of the states, and one of the handouts at the table this morning reveals that, gives you a very nice map showing what's happening where. There were several attempts at the federal level that failed, and Americans United was very prominent in the lead of opposing and ultimately defeating those bills. In California, a voucher that would provide money for private and parochial education, which was supported by Governor Wilson, passed the Assembly in May by a vote of 41-35, but it did not survive through the Senate Education Committee. A Democratic alternative bill dealing with public schools and economic improvement passed the Senate this past June. Next, I would like to talk a little bit about creationism. It is another subject that will not go away, and in fact one of the workshops this morning is devoted to it, so I will say nothing more about it. I would like to take another quick minute or two to give you some judicial update. As I'm sure some of you are aware, the Federal Election Commission has filed a suit last July against the Christian Coalition. This culminated 4 years of investigation and the gathering of massive data that revealed clearly that the Christian Coalition is really a political organization rather than a religious endeavor. Judging from the reaction of the Christian Coalition to that lawsuit, they are very worried about it. Part of the original lawsuit did not go through because it was blocked by Republicans, which would have asked the Christian Coalition to register as a political, as a PAC. This omission, unfortunately, would allow them to continue with their stealth techniques, which would have been reversed had that element in the lawsuit been included. Regardless of the ultimate outcome, which may be, a fair amount of time down the road, the immediate impact of this lawsuit on churches is significant, and it dovetails nicely with Americans United's Project Fair Play, which is aimed at reminding and educating houses of worship as to the status of the law in terms of politicking and the risk to those organizations, to those churches, about the loss of tax-exempt status if indeed they engage in improper politicking.
Stephen Green, keynote speaker, a former law professor, now legal director for Americans United, has been involved in nearly every church-state case before the Supreme Court in the past several years.
I wanted to talk about just initially is kind of set the stage and talk about the religious right from a legal perspective to a certain extent. Some of the things that I do as legal director of Americans United, some of the challenges that we're facing this year and in other years, but then talk more particularly just about an aspect of the religious right that may not be as familiar to everybody, but is nevertheless something we should all be concerned about. I've just finished reading a book called Cosmos Crumbling. It's a book about the evangelical reform movement in the antebellum period of America, the early 19th century. And it's about this important period in our history where evangelicals got together and decided that they needed to help try to remake America or try to preserve America. And the reform movement is very important because it brought out many of those impulses that are extremely significant in our history, such as women's suffrage, the abolition movement, child labor laws. These are all very important things that the evangelical reform movement brought to being. But the reform movement in the early 19th century had a dark side. And part of that dark side was some of the same individuals who wanted to reform America in some positive ways saw the disestablishment that had occurred previously after the American Revolution, with the writing of the Constitution. They saw the increased pluralism in this country. They saw the Jeffersonian impulses of common rights of all individuals, of democracy. And they became really concerned. And what I like about this book, and the reason I'm mentioning it, is that they saw their cosmos crumbling. They saw their conception of the world all of a sudden being challenged by all of these disparate influences. And they wanted to try to, in some way, hold together their vision of a godly nation, of a godly country. And so as a result, in addition to those positive things that came about through the reform movement, as I said, abolition, women's suffrage, child labor laws, you also saw an increase in Sabbath persecution. You saw an attempt to impose blasphemy laws again from the old colonial period. In essence, it was a concern that they had on how to hold on to what they considered to be the religious truths, to hold on to be what they thought was the valid religious practice in reaction to the rising pluralism and, as I said, the separation of church and state that had come about through disestablishment. There are a lot of parallels. There are a lot of parallels between the early 19th century and what we're seeing today. I think everyone is aware of the phenomenal growth of the religious right over the past 15 years. What started out as a very small movement that was brought about by Paul Weyrich of the Heritage Foundation and kind of put in motion by some little-known TV evangelist from the Blue Ridge of Virginia named Jerry Falwell, has now in 15, 16 years has grown into this massive political force. The religious right now, it seems is ubiquitous. It seems like it's everywhere. Its leaders are household names: James Dobson, Pat Robertson, Ralph Reed, the cover boy of Time magazine a while back, Randall Terry, and Jerry Falwell's still out there. I saw him on TV a little while ago, and he's still out there agitating. But there are even less known figures that still command a lot of power, not only within Washington, but throughout the country. People like Phyllis Schlafly, Beverly LaHaye, John Whitehead, and then California's own Lou Sheldon and Robert Simons. The religious right's constantly on the airways, both on their own networks and then on other television and radio shows. I read this book several years ago that talked about it's called The Culture of Disbelief by a Yale law professor, who talked about how evangelical Christians somehow have been put upon by the media, and that they have somehow been placed into some type of second-class status in this country. And what I find interesting about that argument, and not to go into it, but what I find interesting about that argument is that, I don't know if you realize, but did you know that there are 3 times as many evangelical TV and radio stations in the country as there are public television and radio stations in the country? Most of those, of course, broadcast shows by James Dobson and Beverly LaHaye and others. But I think more particular our concerns today, and our concerns right now, are the effect that the religious right has on the political arena, because something I think that needs to be made clear today, when we are talking about the religious right here, and we will be criticizing the religious right, we do not want to be misunderstood as criticizing conservative or evangelical Christianity or any other religious movement. It's not the fact that people of faith use their faith and go in and become active in social issues. That is not a problem, and that is something we should all commend. The problem is when people of faith use their faith as a club, and they use their faith to narrow the rights of other individuals. And that is the problem with the religious right. As it now stands, especially in the political arena, unfortunately, most Republican candidates for public office cannot gain the party endorsement unless they curry the favor of the Christian Coalition or some other religious right group. Presidential candidates curry the favor. They kind of go and almost have meetings with the religious right leaders, figures such as Robertson and Reed. And in many places, the religious right holds the balance in elections. Remember the photographs from the convention of the Republican National Committee in San Diego recently, when you saw Beverly LaHaye, Ralph Reed, and Gary Bauer, who is James Dobson's man in Washington, coming out of the platform committee meetings and smiling and saying they'd gotten everything that they wanted out of the platform. That's amazing to think that one particular aspect of a religious movement could command that type of control. As we saw in 1994 and witnessing again in this year's presidential race, in the campaigns for state and local offices, candidates are being held to a litmus test that conforms to the radical religious rights agenda. Pro-school prayer, pro-private school religious school vouchers, anti-abortion, anti-gay rights, and pro-free market, which I've never understood how that becomes necessarily a religious issue, but it is these days. As I said, the religious right wields enormous power within the Republican Party, and they hope to reshape America into their version of what is a Christian nation. The religious right's influence, however, does not end solely with elections. It extends into the halls of Congress, and as Dr. Suarez was just mentioning a few moments ago. Remember the media attention that surrounded the Christian Coalition's announcement of their contract with the American family back about a year and a half ago. It set the whole tone for the 104th Congress. Do you remember seeing the press conference, and you had all of these politicians scrambling to get on the stage with Ralph Reed so they could have their photograph with him? The contract on America, or for America as we call it, contract on America, became marching orders for many conservative Republicans who knew all too well that those issues would soon appear on the voters' guides, which will be appearing in a church near you any day now. Fortunately, thanks to the efforts of many of you here in the audience, the hard work, and the work of organizations like Americans United and our allies such as the ACLU and People for the American Way and Planned Parenthood and many other great organizations, we were able to prevent most of the contract from going into effect. We did lose a few important battles, such as welfare reform, which authorizes giving churches blank checks to basically administer welfare and determine even eligibility of individuals. That reminds me of my grandfather, who ran a mission down in downtown Fort Worth before I was born, and he used to, before he would allow the poor derelicts and the drunks to come in and get a bowl of soup and to have a place to sleep, he would make sure they listened to one of his hour-long fire and brimstone sermons. And if they didn't sit through that, then they didn't get that soup and they didn't get that place to sleep at night. I don't think necessarily that exactly is going to happen, but the welfare reform bill actually allows those types of things to happen, allows churches to determine who is eligible and who is not, and determine what rules people need to go by to get their public entitlements. Many of you are familiar with a lot of this, and I don't need to go into that, and I think we will hear a lot more today. I mean, I'm looking forward to hearing Governor Weicker and Barry Lynn talk today about the problems that are facing us with the religious right, and also hearing the panel discussions from Washington. What I want to do in the brief, probably 5 minutes that I have, is just to talk about one aspect of the religious right that I want to make sure everybody is aware of. You probably are. It's that effort by the religious right not only to change the political system, to put their people into the school boards, into public offices, but it's also the more subtle program of the religious right to remake the law in their own image. It's kind of it's the two-tiered attack, and this is a lot less visible. What we've seen in the last 6 to 7 years, and what I've seen as a lawyer, is a dramatic upsurge in cases and in litigation that has been filed by the religious right. Where only as recently as 10 years ago, the majority of church-state cases that were filed in this country, and in particular cases like prayer and Bible reading in the public school, were filed by organizations like ACLU or Americans United. Now, vast majority of the cases that come up through the court systems have been filed by parents who are opposing certain aspects of curriculum, who are saying that the public schools are hostile to their own religious faith. And most, if not all, of these cases are being orchestrated, funded, and supported by these brand new religious right legal groups, these legal arms of the Christian Coalition and other aspects of the religious right. This is clearly a growth industry. Whereas 15 years ago, there were arguably no religious right legal groups out there. Now there are close to 10 who are actively litigating. Not only do you have the American Center for Law and Justice, Pat Robertson's organization, but you have organizations like the Becket Fund, the Rutherford Institute, the Western Center for Law and Religious Freedom, I think it's called out here, the Christian Legal Society, Concerned Women for America, America Family Association. You don't want me to go on, but I have some more. There are many of those groups. In addition to those religious right groups, I spend a lot of my time, because I work a lot on voucher cases, fighting against some libertarian groups that don't necessarily have a religious agenda, but are trying to ensure that there are private school vouchers throughout the country. Landmark Legal Foundation and the Institute for Justice, which play into the hands of the religious right. They spread vicious rumors and misinformation about textbooks and curriculum, that outcome-based education and other attempts to reform education is a form of mind control, or that sex education promotes promiscuity or homosexuality. And what I find interesting is then, inconsistently, they try to sneak through the back door teaching Bible and religion under the rules that allow you to teach about religion. In essence, what they do is they have now gone and told a lot of parents that their children's rights are being infringed on and that they need to file suits, they need to cause more problems in the courts in order to preserve their religious rights. I acknowledge that the Supreme Court's decisions on church-state are not clear. They really are not in some ways. But what we tried to do a couple of years ago is we got a group of organizations together across the spectrum to prepare something we called the Joint Statement on Religion and Public Education, where we tried to set out those issues about religion and public education that were non-controversial, that everyone could agree, consensus statements, so we could try to cut through some of the myths and misinformation that are out there about what's permissible in the public schools or not. I can still remember this first meeting that we had because we invited members of the religious right to come to this meeting. And so we had members from Concerned Women from America, we had members of the Christian Coalition, American Center for Law and Justice, the Rutherford Institute, all of those primary groups there. And we told them what we were wanting to do. And I bet you can guess what happened. They didn't show up at any other meeting. They didn't want to participate in an effort to try to cut through the misinformation and misunderstanding about religion and public education. We were still able, though, to come out with a consensus statement among a lot of religious and civil rights groups. And I'm proud to say we were able to give it to the President. The President read it. He adopted it in a speech about 1.5 years ago and directed the Department of Education to issue guidelines that would help go through some of this misinformation that is out there. But it's not in the religious rights' vested interest to ensure there is a lack of misinformation. They like to create trouble about these issues. And this is a concern that we have and something we're continuing to fight. The other way, and I need to stop in just a couple of minutes, and I'd be happy to answer questions later. I don't think I'll have time right now, but please feel free to catch me if you have any questions. The other thing they're wanting to do, as I said, about affecting the law is not only are they filing all these lawsuits to try to change the law, they're coming around now from behind and trying to change the rules of the game. And this is primarily what Dr. Suarez said about constitutional amendment. Not only do they want to complain about the Supreme Court cases, now they're wanting to come underneath and cut the Supreme Court's knees out from under them. Change through constitutional amendment. My friends, this is the most serious challenge we face, period. It is the most pernicious thing that is out there. For more than 205 years, we have been able to benefit from the concept of separation of church and state. We have more religious diversity, more pluralism, more people attend church, synagogue, temple, mosque, whatever, on a given weekend than any other country in the world, bar countries where there is an established religion. More people in this country say they believe in God or in some supreme being or faith than any other country in the world. But notwithstanding all those facts and all those figures, what we have now are individuals on the right who are trying to go and amend the First Amendment to the Constitution to change that bulwark of freedom that we've known and we've had and we've respected for for the last 205 years. And in doing so, they would literally throw the baby out with the bathwater. They would allow for vouchers, they would allow for school prayer, they would allow for government use and misuse of religion in public events. It would be a total reversal of everything that this organization and many other organizations have worked on for the last 50 years. Well, I hate to end on such a sour note. That is pretty pessimistic. Let me just say we're working hard, and we're continuing to work hard, and we so far have done a very good job at defeating most of these battles. But the point is that it's up to you. We need you to be our eyes and ears when events are going on in your community. We need you as individuals to go out there, introduce yourself to your state legislators, become aware of local legislation that's going on, whether it's county level, whether it's school board level, and let them know that you are there. Become familiar with the issues. And as I said, when you see an event coming up or some incident coming up that's an attempt to either censor textbooks, to infuse creationism into the public schools, to return organized prayer and Bible reading in the schools, to promote vouchers, or to promote other forms of intolerance in the society, then you need to be able to be there and to stand up and say no, that you're opposed to that, and let us know so we can work with you to ensure that we have a pluralistic country, a country that is full of faith and freedom, not a country that is full of imposed faith of one particular group. Thank you very much.
Realization of this project was made possible by a generous grant from the James Hervey Johnson Charitable Educational Trust. This program was produced by the Atheist United TV project team. Your comments and suggestions regarding our programming and inquiries regarding Atheist United are cordially invited. Write to Atheist United, Post Office Box 57435, Sherman Oaks, California, zip 91413, or call area code 818-785-1743. We invite you to contact any of the Atheist Alliance societies which are listed on your screen by consulting the phone book in their area.